The emails you receive after you die. Part 1. The first message. Chapter 1. Subject line. Mark Soren had never been superstitious about death, not in the way some people were, not with the nervous jokes and avoidance rituals and constant low-level anxiety that mortality inspired in those who'd spent too much time contemplating the inevitable endpoint toward which all lives progressed, regardless of belief or hope, or desperate bargaining with whatever cosmic forces might be listening. He'd lost his father at 19, had watched cancer consume him over 18 brutal months, had been present for the final breathing, and the moment when breathing stopped, and the terrible stillness that followed when a body became an object, when a person became remains, when someone who'd existed with thoughts and preferences and accumulated memories suddenly ceased in every meaningful sense, despite the temporary persistence of flesh that would itself decay given sufficient time. That experience had taught him something about death that most people his age, 32, healthy, no chronic conditions or lifestyle factors that suggested imminent decline, didn't understand yet. Death was mundane. Death was ordinary. Death happened constantly, everywhere, to everyone eventually, and the universe didn't care about timing or fairness, or whether someone had finished what they'd started, or reconciled with estranged family, or achieved the vague life goals that people told themselves mattered, despite evidence suggesting nothing actually mattered in any cosmic sense that transcended individual perspective. Death was just the end of biological processes, just cells ceasing to function, just consciousness terminating because the substrate supporting consciousness had failed. Nothing mystical, nothing supernatural, nothing that required elaborate spiritual frameworks or comforting narratives about persistence beyond material existence, which made what happened on the morning of October 23rd so thoroughly, fundamentally disturbing. Mark woke at 6:47 a.m., 3 minutes before his alarm, the way he usually did, his internal clock having adjusted over years of maintaining consistent sleep schedule despite occasional temptation to stay up late or sleep in on weekends. The bedroom was still dark, curtains blocking the weak autumn sunlight that wouldn't fully penetrate the gloom for another 40 minutes. His apartment was silent, except for the ambient noise of the building itself. Distant pipes, the hum of refrigerator in the kitchen, the barely audible vibration of traffic on the street 3 stories below. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, habitual gesture, automatic action performed before consciousness fully returned, before his brain had finished transitioning from sleep state to waking awareness. The screen illuminated his face with cold blue light that made him squint, despite his eyes being mostly adjusted to the darkness. He scrolled through notifications with practiced efficiency. Weather forecast. Overcast, high of 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Calendar reminder about the 2 p.m. meeting with Stevens about the quarterly projections. News headlines he barely processed because they were variations on familiar themes of political dysfunction and environmental crisis, and the endless churn of current events that would be forgotten within news cycles or weeks. And then he saw it. An email notification from an address he recognized because it was his own. mark.soren.1991@gmail.com. Sent to himself from himself at 3:17 a.m. while he'd been asleep, while his phone had been on the nightstand untouched, while nothing should have been accessing his account because his computer was off and his laptop was closed and he hadn't authorized any scheduled sends or automated messages. The subject line made his chest tighten, made his breath catch, made his fingers freeze mid-scroll because the words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, violated the basic reality of his continued existence. Subject: the first day without you. Mark stared at the notification for several seconds, not opening it, not deleting it, just processing the implications of those 5 words arranged in that particular order. Someone had sent him an email with a subject line suggesting he was gone, was absent, was no longer present in whatever context you referred to. A joke, probably. A prank from someone who'd gained access to his account, despite 2-factor authentication and password that followed all the recommended security practices. Or spam, sophisticated enough to spoof his own address, to make it appear he was emailing himself when the message actually originated from external source, using techniques he didn't understand but had heard about in articles about phishing and social engineering. He should delete it, should mark it as spam, should run antivirus scan and change his password and enable additional security measures to prevent whoever had sent this from accessing his account again. But he opened it instead, because curiosity outweighed caution, because not knowing felt worse than whatever revelation the message might contain, because his rational understanding that this was almost certainly malicious attempt to compromise his data or install malware or extract personal information couldn't quite suppress the irrational need to see what someone thought was worth sending at 3:17 in the morning with subject line that referenced his absence as if it were fact rather than impossible hypothetical. The email loaded. No images. No attachments. Just plain text, left-aligned default font. Professional format despite the disturbing content. From mark.soren1991@gmail.com to mark.soren.1991@gmail.com. Sent October 23rd, 3:17 a.m. Subject, the first day without you. They found you at 9:23 a.m. Your landlord specifically. Mrs. Chen from 4B. She noticed your door was slightly ajar when she came up to ask about the noise complaint from last Thursday, the one you thought you'd resolved by apologizing about the dropped bookshelf at 11 p.m. that you told her was an accident, even though you'd actually thrown it during the argument with Rachel about her suggestion that you were emotionally unavailable, a phrase you've always hated because it implies failure to perform intimacy according to someone else's expectations rather than acknowledging that people express connection differently. Mrs. Chen knocked, called your name, pushed the door open wider when you didn't respond, found you in the living room, on the floor between the couch and the coffee table, not breathing, skin already beginning to show the lividity that indicates cessation of circulation. She screamed, high-pitched, sustained, the kind of sound that brings neighbors into hallways despite urban tendency to ignore disturbances because everyone assumes someone else will investigate, someone else will call for help, someone else will take responsibility. 3 neighbors arrived within 90 seconds. Mr. Patterson from 3A, the college students from 3C whose names you never learned despite living above them for 2 years. They called 911. Paramedics arrived at 9:31. Pronounced you dead at 9:34 after brief attempt at resuscitation that everyone present knew was futile because you'd clearly been gone for hours, because rigor mortis was already setting in, because death was obvious to anyone with basic medical knowledge or experience with bodies that have stopped functioning. Your mother received the call at 10:17 a.m. She was at work, teaching sophomore English at Westfield High, specifically discussing symbolism in The Great Gatsby with students who were mostly not paying attention because they were checking their phones or passing notes or simply enduring the 50-minute period until lunch. She answered her cell phone despite school policy discouraging personal calls during class time because the number showed as county coroner. And she knew immediately, knew with the terrible certainty that parents develop after years of low-level anxiety about their adult children living far away in cities where bad things happen with statistical regularity, that something had happened to you. She left school without finishing the period, drove home in violation of every traffic law, called your sister, who didn't answer because she was in deposition and had her phone silenced, called your stepfather, who promised to cancel his afternoon appointments and meet her at home, sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where you ate breakfast throughout your childhood, where you complained about homework and told stories about friends whose names she no longer remembers, and sobbed in a way you'd only heard once before, at your father's funeral, when grief was too large for quiet crying and required sounds that came from somewhere deeper than normal emotional expression. Rachel learned at 2:43 p.m. when she finally checked her messages during break between meetings. She'd ignored 3 calls from your mother and 2 from your sister because she assumed they were related to you contacting family about the relationship difficulties you'd been experiencing, about the conversations you'd been having about whether you were moving forward together or just going through motions. phrases she'd used that you'd found simultaneously accurate and painful because they suggested your 2 years together had become routine rather than chosen, automatic rather than intentional. She called your mother back, listened to the news, said, "Oh my God," 17 times in 2 minutes according to the call log, ended the conversation abruptly, sat in her office bathroom stall for 45 minutes crying into paper towels she kept having to replace because they disintegrated with wetness and couldn't absorb the volume of tears she was producing. Her coworker Jessica, the one you met twice at company events and thought was trying too hard to be friendly, found her eventually, helped her compose herself enough to leave the building, drove her home because Rachel was clearly in no condition to operate vehicles safely. Your best friend Daniel learned at 6:34 p.m. from Facebook post your sister made because she couldn't handle making individual calls to everyone in your social circle, couldn't spend hours repeating the same information over and over, couldn't endure the reactions and questions and expressions of shock that would be sincere but wouldn't change anything, wouldn't bring you back, wouldn't make the reality any less terrible. Daniel called immediately. Spoke to your mother for 11 minutes. Asked questions she couldn't answer. Why? How? Was there any indication? Had you seemed depressed? She told him you'd seemed fine the last time you'd spoken, which was Sunday during your weekly call, which you'd kept because your father's death had taught you that family contact shouldn't be postponed or taken for granted because time was finite and opportunities for connection could end without warning. This is what the first day without you looked like. This is how your absence rippled outward from the point of discovery. This is the shape your death took in other people's lives. More tomorrow. Mark, deceased. Mark stared at the screen until his eyes began to hurt from not blinking, until the words started to blur together, until his conscious mind finished processing the content and his emotional response caught up with his rational understanding that what he'd just read was impossible, was wrong, was violation of reality, so profound it required reevaluation of everything he thought he knew about how the world operated. Someone had written detailed narrative of his death, had described the discovery of his body with specificity that suggested either elaborate research into his life, his landlord's name, his Thursday noise complaint, his relationship difficulties with Rachel, his mother's occupation, his weekly phone calls with family, or access to information no one outside his immediate circle should possess, had described his mother's reaction with details that felt authentic, that matched how he imagined she would respond based on his knowledge of her personality and his memory of how she'd grieved his father, had included specific timestamps and call logs and behavioral details that would be impossible to fabricate without some form of surveillance or monitoring that would itself be criminal violation of privacy. Had signed it, Mark, deceased, as if he were writing from beyond death, as if consciousness persisted after biological termination, as if the dead could send emails to their living selves describing their own absence. His first thought was practical. Someone had hacked his account. This was phishing attempt, psychological manipulation designed to elicit response or click malicious link or provide information that would compromise security. He needed to change his password immediately, needed to enable additional verification, needed to report this to email provider and possibly law enforcement because impersonating someone and describing their fictional death felt like it should violate some statute, even if he didn't know the specific legal framework. His second thought was darker. Someone was threatening him. This was prelude to actual harm. Someone who knew details about his life, perhaps Rachel, who'd have access to much of this information and would know how to hurt him psychologically after their recent arguments, or perhaps someone else entirely, someone he hadn't identified as threat, was preparing to act and wanted him afraid first, wanted him destabilized, wanted him vulnerable. His third thought, arriving with sick certainty despite his rational mind rejecting the premise, this felt real. The tone was wrong for threat. The details were wrong for manipulation. The entire structure was wrong for any normal category of malicious communication. This felt like someone was actually describing his death, was actually recounting events that had somehow occurred in reality that shouldn't exist yet but apparently did. He checked the sent folder. No record of sending this email at 3:17 a.m. He checked his login history. No suspicious access from unfamiliar locations or devices. He checked his trash and spam folders. Nothing unusual. The email existed in his inbox but left no other traces, no evidence of how it had been composed or transmitted. His phone buzzed with calendar reminder. 7 a.m., morning routine. He'd set recurring reminder months ago, during brief period of trying to establish better habits, trying to be more intentional about his time management, trying to optimize his productivity according to principles he'd read in self-help books that promised significant life improvements through marginal daily adjustments. Morning routine. Coffee and shower and breakfast, and the 20-minute commute to the office where he worked as financial analyst for mid-sized consulting firm. Normal activities. Ordinary day. Nothing that suggested he was hours away from being found dead on his living room floor by landlord who'd come to discuss Thursday's noise complaint, except he was holding his phone, reading email that described exactly that scenario, reading detailed account of his own death and the reactions of people he knew, reading message that claimed to be from his deceased self. Mark's hands were shaking. He noticed this distantly, observed the tremor as if it belonged to someone else, as if his nervous system's response to extreme stress was interesting phenomenon to catalog rather than personal experience requiring emotional processing. He should call someone, should report this, should seek help or advice, or at minimum tell another person about this message so there would be witness, so there would be verification, so he wouldn't be alone with this knowledge if something actually happened to him. But who would believe him? What would he even say? I received email from myself describing my own death. They'd think he was having breakdown, was experiencing delusion, was fabricating drama for attention, or suffering from mental health crisis that required intervention. And maybe he was. Maybe this was hallucination. Maybe he was still asleep, and this entire morning was dream that felt real, because his sleeping brain was generating sensory details with sufficient fidelity to pass as waking experience. Maybe he'd already died, perhaps in his sleep, perhaps from carbon monoxide or aneurysm or any of the other sudden causes that claimed people without warning. And this was some kind of post-death consciousness, some fragment of awareness that persisted briefly after biological termination and was generating final experiences before final dissolution. He pinched his arm hard enough to hurt. Pain was sharp, immediate, exactly as pain should feel in waking state. Not conclusive evidence, he'd read that dream pain could feel real, but suggestive that he was actually awake, actually experiencing this, actually holding phone displaying email that described his own death. The time in the corner of his screen read 6:53 a.m. 6 minutes had passed since he'd woken up. 6 minutes during which his entire understanding of reality had been fundamentally challenged. He got out of bed because remaining still felt impossible, felt like accepting paralysis, felt like surrendering to whatever was happening, rather than attempting to understand or resist or maintain some semblance of control over situation that seemed designed to strip away his agency and leave him passive recipient of information about his own predetermined ending. He made coffee because routine was anchor, because familiar actions provided structure when understanding failed, because his hands needed something to do besides shake, while his mind tried to process implications of the email that might be threat or hallucination or impossible communication from alternate timeline where he'd already died. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed and produced its normal brown liquid that smelled like it always smelled and tasted like it always tasted when he took cautious sip from mug that said, "World's okayest analyst." Ironic gift from Daniel last Christmas, joke about Mark's tendency towards self-deprecation, reminder of friendship that had survived since college despite geographic distance and life changes. Daniel, who in the email's account had learned of Mark's death at 6:34 p.m. from Facebook post, who had called Mark's mother and asked questions she couldn't answer, who had presumably grieved in whatever way Daniel grieved because they'd never discussed how either of them processed loss, despite being friends for over a decade. Mark picked up his phone again, opened the email again, reread the entire message carefully, looking for clues, looking for inconsistencies, looking for anything that would reveal this as fabrication rather than genuine account of events that had somehow occurred in reality that ran parallel to his own. But everything checked out, every detail was accurate. Mrs. Chen did live in 4B. He had dropped the bookshelf last Thursday at 11 p.m., had apologized to her the next day, had described it as accident rather than explaining it was result of argument with Rachel about emotional availability. His mother did teach at Westfield High. His sister did work at law firm where depositions were common. Rachel's coworker was named Jessica. He did have weekly Sunday calls with his mother. Whoever had written this knew him, knew his life, knew details that weren't publicly available, that couldn't be gleaned from social media or public records or casual observation. This required either extensive surveillance or insider knowledge or access to information through means Mark couldn't identify. Or it required being him, required being Mark Soren, writing from perspective of his own death. Required consciousness that persisted beyond biological termination and had capacity to send retrospective accounts of its own ending to its living self. His rational mind rejected this premise completely. His emotional response suggested it might be true anyway. The signature at the bottom of the email drew his attention. Mark deceased. Not Mark's ghost, or Mark's spirit, or any phrasing that suggested supernatural continuation. Just deceased, past participle, adjective describing state of being dead, medical and legal term for bodies that had stopped functioning. As if the sender was him but was also dead. As if consciousness and biological status were separable qualities that could coexist in email signature. As if the person who'd written this was simultaneously Mark Soren and deceased, both entities at once, occupying impossible category that shouldn't exist but apparently did. Mark's phone buzzed again. Another email notification. Same sender, same impossible address, new subject line. His thumb hovered over the notification for several seconds before he could force himself to tap it, before he could overcome the resistance that came from knowing he was about to receive more information that would further destabilize his understanding of reality, that would provide additional evidence for phenomenon that violated everything he thought he knew about death and consciousness and the basic rules governing existence. The second email loaded from mark.soren.1991@gmail.com to marksoren1991@gmail.com. Sent October 23, 7:02 a.m. Subject: They're looking for reasons, Mark Karn. You're reading this while drinking coffee. Ethiopian blend from the place on Morrison Street that you discovered 6 months ago and have been loyal to despite it being slightly out of your way, because consistency in small pleasures feels important when larger life elements remain uncertain. You're standing in your kitchen, wearing the gray sweatpants and white t-shirt you slept in. Hair uncombed, face unwashed. Still processing the first email and trying to determine whether you're experiencing genuine phenomenon or elaborate hoax or mental health crisis. The answer is genuine phenomenon, though not in the way you're imagining. This isn't communication from afterlife. This isn't ghost story. This isn't consciousness persisting beyond death in metaphysical sense that would require reevaluating everything science understands about neurology and identity. This is communication across timelines, from reality where you died to reality where you haven't. From timeline that diverged from yours at some point, possibly recently, possibly decades ago, possibly before you were born, depending on how far back the branch point extends, and followed different trajectory that resulted in your death on October 23rd while you continued living in your timeline. I'm you. But I'm also not you. I'm the Mark Soren who died. You're the Mark Soren who's still alive. We're the same person up until whatever moment caused our timelines to split. After that point, we've had different experiences, made different choices, encountered different circumstances. But we're similar enough that information from my timeline remains relevant to yours. And I'm sending these emails because your timeline is converging with mine. The branch point that separated us is closing. Events that occurred in my reality are beginning to occur in yours. The circumstances that led to my death are are replicating themselves in your timeline with sufficient fidelity that the same outcome is likely unless you recognize the pattern and intervene. They're looking for reasons why you died. Your mother, your sister, Rachel, Daniel, everyone who knew you is trying to understand, trying to find explanation, trying to identify cause that would make sense of sudden loss, that would allow them to construct narrative where your death was preventable or at least understandable rather than random tragedy that struck without warning or reason. Your mother is going through your apartment right now, in my timeline, 3 weeks after your death, accompanied by your sister because neither of them could bear to do this alone. Looking for clues, looking for signs, looking for anything that would explain why healthy 32-year-old man with stable job and active social life would suddenly die alone in his apartment on Tuesday morning. They find things you didn't want them to find. Everyone has private aspects they don't share with family. Everyone maintains boundaries between public self and internal experience. Everyone has thoughts and behaviors and preferences they keep hidden because revealing them would create discomfort or judgment, or simply because some things belong to individual rather than being shared with collective. Your mother finds the journal you've been keeping since February, the physical notebook with the green cover that you hide in the drawer beneath your socks, because writing by hand feels more private than digital documentation, feels less vulnerable to hacking or accidental discovery, feels like it creates genuine separation between your inner world and the external reality you navigate daily. She reads it, every page, every entry, every description of your relationship difficulties with Rachel, your concerns about career direction, your philosophical questions about purpose and meaning, your periodic sense that you're going through motions rather than actively choosing your life. She reads your honesty about depression, not clinical, not requiring medication, but the low-level existential weight that many people carry without acknowledging, the sense that life lacks significance beyond the meaning individuals construct for themselves. She reads your entry from 3 days before your death, October 20th, in my timeline, where you wrote, "Sometimes I think about what it would be like if I just stopped. If I didn't have to continue making choices and navigating relationships and maintaining the performance of being functional adult. Not that I want to die, just that I'm tired of the effort required to live." She shows this to your sister. They discuss whether this was suicidal ideation, whether you were planning something, whether they missed signs, whether they should have noticed your struggles and intervened before it was too late. This is what happens after death, the living search for explanations. They reinterpret your private thoughts through the lens of your absence. They construct narratives that may not match your actual experience but serve their need to understand, to find meaning, to avoid the terrible possibility that your death was random and therefore could happen to them or their loved ones without warning or preventable cause. Rachel is also looking for reasons, but her search is different. She's looking for evidence that your relationship was deteriorating more severely than she recognized. Looking for confirmation that the arguments you were having were symptoms of deeper incompatibility rather than normal friction. Looking for justification to feel less guilty about the things she said during your last conversation. The one on October 20th that ended with her telling you she needed space to think. And you responding that space was fine, that you understood, that you'd wait for her to process whatever she needed to process. In my timeline, your last conversation with Rachel happened at 8:17 p.m. on October 20th. You spoke for 14 minutes. She told you she was questioning whether the relationship was sustainable long-term. You asked what that meant. She said she didn't know yet, but she needed time without pressure to evaluate her feelings. You said okay. You told her you loved her. She said, "I know," instead of saying it back, which hurt more than if she'd said nothing. You spent October 21st and 22nd respecting her request for space. Didn't call, didn't text, didn't initiate contact, waited for her to reach out when she was ready. She never did. Your next interaction was supposed to be October 24th, Wednesday evening, dinner at the Italian place you both liked, conversation about where the relationship was going, but you died on October 23rd. So that conversation never happened, and Rachel is left wondering whether her request for space contributed to your death, whether the stress of relationship uncertainty caused cardiac event or drove you to self-harm or somehow made you vulnerable to whatever killed you. Daniel is looking for reasons too, but his search is more pragmatic. He's reviewing your last messages, your social media posts, your recent behavior during the times you saw each other, trying to determine if you gave any indication of health problems or dangerous situations or anything that would suggest risk. He finds nothing, which disturbs him more than finding something would have, because nothing suggests your death was completely unexpected, completely preventable, completely random, which means death can strike without warning, which means anyone can die at any time, which means life is more fragile than comfortable narratives about health and safety allow most people to acknowledge. This is what I learned after dying. Death reveals, strips away privacy, exposes what you wanted hidden, forces your internal world to become external knowledge. Everyone you know will have access to your private spaces, will read your unshared thoughts, will know your secrets, unless you prevent your death, unless you recognize the pattern, unless you use the information I'm providing to change the outcome. Check your calendar. Look at what's scheduled for 9 a.m. Mark, deceased. Mark's hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the phone. He set it on the counter with exaggerated care, as if the device itself was fragile, as if normal handling might damage whatever impossible connection allowed him to receive emails from alternate timeline where he'd already died. His calendar. The email had told him to check his calendar, to look at what was scheduled for 9 a.m. He already knew. He didn't need to check. He'd seen the notification earlier, but hadn't processed it fully because the first email had consumed his attention, had displaced everything else, had made all other information seem trivial by comparison. But he opened the calendar anyway, confirmed what he already knew, read the entry that appeared at 9 a.m. every Tuesday. Building maintenance, elevator inspection. Mrs. Chen notified all tenants 10:15. The elevator. Mrs. Chen had sent building-wide email on October 15th informing everyone that the elevator would be undergoing mandatory safety inspection on Tuesday, October 23rd at 9 a.m. Residents were advised to use stairs if they needed to leave during inspection period. Mark lived on the third floor. He always took the stairs anyway because he'd read that incorporating incidental exercise into daily routine was more sustainable than dedicated gym sessions, because he liked the small physical exertion that got his blood moving in the morning, because elevator in his building was old and slow and sometimes made concerning noises that suggested imminent failure. But Mrs. Chen also lived in the building, on the fourth floor. And according to the first email, she was the one who'd found his body at 9:23 a.m. After noticing his door was slightly ajar, after coming to ask about Thursday's noise complaint, why would Mrs. Chen be walking past his apartment at 9:23 on Tuesday morning? Her unit was above his. If she needed to leave the building during elevator inspection, she would take the stairs. But the stairs didn't pass his door. The stairwell entrance was at the opposite end of the hallway, unless she was going to his apartment specifically, unless she had reason to be at his door, unless something about the elevator inspection or the timing or the particular circumstances of Tuesday morning created situation where Mrs. Chen would be checking on him right around the time the email claimed she'd discovered his body. Mark's coffee had gone cold. He poured it down the sink and made fresh cup because the ritual of preparation gave his hands something to do, gave his mind momentary focus on physical tasks rather than spiraling through implications of impossible emails that seemed designed to predict or describe or somehow create the circumstances of his death. The second email had described things it shouldn't know, had mentioned the Ethiopian coffee from Morrison Street that he'd been buying for 6 months, had known he was standing in his kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and white t-shirt, had referenced his location and activity while he was reading with accuracy that suggested real-time observation rather than retrospective description, had mentioned his journal, the green notebook hidden beneath his socks. the entry from October 20th about being tired of the effort required to live. Words he'd written 3 days ago, in reality, that was presumably his own timeline, rather than the alternate timeline the emails claimed to originate from. But if both timelines shared that entry, if both versions of Mark had written those same words on the same date, then the timelines were converging as the second email claimed. Events were replicating across parallel realities. His timeline was following the same trajectory that had led to his death in the alternate timeline, which meant he needed to identify what killed him, needed to understand the mechanism, needed to determine what happened between now and 9:23 a.m. that would result in Mrs. Chen finding him dead on his living room floor. His phone buzzed. Another notification. But not email this time. Text message from Rachel. "Can we talk? I know I said I needed space, but I've been thinking and I don't want to leave things uncertain. Coffee later? My treat." Mark stared at the message for several seconds, trying to determine if this was coincidence or confirmation. In the alternate timeline, according to the second email, he'd had his last conversation with Rachel on October 20th at 8:17 p.m. She'd requested space. He'd respected that request. They were supposed to meet October 24th, Wednesday, to discuss the relationship's future. But this message suggested different timeline, suggested Rachel was reaching out sooner, suggested the pattern was already diverging from what the emails described. Unless this was the divergence point, unless his timeline and the alternate timeline had been identical until this moment, and Rachel's text represented the branch, the split, the difference that would determine whether he lived or died. Or unless the text was meaningless, was normal variation that wouldn't affect the fundamental outcome, was noise rather than signal in the larger pattern that would still lead to his death at 9:23 a.m. Regardless of whether he replied to Rachel or ignored her message, he typed response, "Yes. Coffee sounds good. When works for you?" Sent before he could overthink it. Sent before paralysis of analysis could stop him from responding. Sent because maintaining normal behavior felt important when nothing else felt normal, when impossible emails were describing his death, and he didn't know what to do except continue living until he either figured out how to prevent the predicted outcome or experienced the outcome and discovered whether consciousness persisted beyond death in a way that allowed him to send retrospective emails to his living self. Rachel replied immediately. 10:30? The place on Henderson? Mark confirmed, felt momentary relief. If he had coffee with Rachel at 10:30, he'd be alive at 10:30, which meant he'd survive past 9:23, which meant whatever the emails predicted wouldn't happen, or wouldn't happen the way they described. Unless he died between now and 10:30, unless the coffee plans were irrelevant, unless Rachel ended up grieving his death instead of having conversation about their relationship. He checked the time. 7:36 a.m. Less than 2 hours until 9:23. Less than 2 hours until he would supposedly be found dead by Mrs. Chen, who would notice his door was ajar and would enter his apartment and would discover him not breathing on the living room floor. He looked at his apartment door. It was closed, locked, 3 deadbolts engaged, because he developed paranoid habit after reading articles about urban crime rates, after watching too many true crime documentaries, after his downstairs neighbor had been burglarized 6 months ago, and he'd upgraded his security response to include excessive locking mechanisms. His door wasn't ajar, wasn't going to become ajar unless he opened it or someone with key accessed his apartment from outside. Mrs. Chen had master key for emergencies, but she wouldn't use it unless there was reason, unless she heard something concerning, unless she suspected danger, unless circumstances warranted entering a tenant's unit without permission. The noise complaint. The first email had mentioned it, had said Mrs. Chen came to discuss Thursday's noise complaint. The bookshelf he'd dropped at 11 p.m. during argument with Rachel about emotional availability. But he'd already apologized for that on Friday morning when he'd seen Mrs. Chen in the lobby. She'd accepted his apology, had said these things happen, had told him not to worry about it. The matter was resolved. There was no reason for her to revisit the issue on Tuesday morning, unless there was additional complaint, unless someone else had reported noise from his apartment, unless Mrs. Chen had received new information that required follow-up conversation. Mark walked through his apartment, checking for anything unusual, for any sign of disturbance or damage or situation that might prompt neighbor complaints. Everything appeared normal. Furniture in usual positions, no broken items, no strange sounds or smells or visual indicators of problems. His phone buzzed again. Email notification. Third message. Same sender. He didn't want to read it, didn't want more information, didn't want additional details about his own death or the aftermath or the way people he knew would grieve and search for reasons and reinterpret his life through lens of his absence. But he opened it anyway, because not knowing felt worse. Because the emails were providing information that might help him survive. Because whatever was sending these messages had access to knowledge he needed if he was going to prevent the predicted outcome. From mark.soren.1991@gmail.com to mark.soren1991@gmail.com. Sent October 23rd, 7:41 a.m. Subject, the divergence point. You just received text from Rachel. This is different from my timeline. In my timeline, she didn't reach out until October 24th, which means your timeline has already diverged from mine at some point between October 20th and now, which means the exact sequence of events leading to my death might not replicate perfectly in your timeline, which means you might survive, or which means you'll die differently. I don't know which outcome will manifest. The emails I'm sending are based on my experience, my timeline, my death. But if your timeline has diverged, if events are occurring in different order or with different details, then my information may not be accurate predictors of what's about to happen to you. But the underlying pattern is the same. The core elements that led to my death are present in your timeline, even if the specific sequence has shifted, and understanding those elements might give you chance to escape. Element 1, the carbon monoxide. You haven't checked your detector recently, haven't tested it, haven't replaced the batteries despite the manufacturer recommendation to replace them every 6 months. The detector in your apartment is 3 years old, still nominally functional, still technically operational, but the sensor has degraded, the response time has slowed, the threshold for alarm activation has shifted. There's a leak, small, gradual, coming from the water heater in your utility closet. The valve connection has been deteriorating for months, maybe longer. The building's last maintenance inspection was 18 months ago. The inspector didn't catch the degradation because it was subtle, because everything appeared nominally functional, because inspection protocols focus on obvious failures rather than incipient problems. The leak is releasing carbon monoxide into your apartment at levels that are below the degraded threshold of your detector. Not enough to trigger alarm, not enough to produce immediate symptoms, but enough to accumulate over hours in the enclosed space of your apartment while you sleep. Enough to kill you if exposure continues long enough. In my timeline, I died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Went to bed on October 22nd feeling slightly off, headache, nausea, general malaise that I attributed to stress or minor illness or insufficient sleep. Woke up several times during the night feeling worse. Finally lost consciousness sometime around 5 a.m. Never woke up again. Mrs. Chen found me at 9:23 because she noticed my door was ajar. But in my timeline, she hadn't come to discuss noise complaint. She came because she smelled gas in the hallway. Called building maintenance. They traced the smell to the leak in my utility closet. Entered my apartment with master key. Found me dead. The door was ajar because maintenance had opened it. Not because I'd left it open. But your timeline has diverged. Your sequence is different. Maybe your door will become ajar for different reason. Maybe Mrs. Chen will find you through different mechanism. Maybe the specific details of discovery will vary even though the underlying cause, the carbon monoxide leak, remains constant across both timelines. Check your utility closet. Check your water heater. Check the valve connections. Look for corrosion, degradation, any sign of gas escape. And open your windows. Get fresh air circulating. Dilute whatever concentration has already accumulated overnight. Do this now, before 9:23. Before the events I'm describing have chance to manifest in your timeline. Element 2. You're not supposed to be reading this yet. The emails are arriving too early in your timeline. My first email was supposed to reach you at 3:17 a.m. Yes, but you weren't supposed to wake up and check your phone until your normal alarm at 6:50 a.m. You weren't supposed to see the messages until after you'd already been exposed to lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide for over 13 hours of sleep, plus the time you'd spend unconscious after alarm failed to wake you. But you woke at 6:47, 3 minutes early, before your alarm, and checked your phone immediately. This is the first divergence. The first difference between my timeline and yours. Small, trivial, 3 minutes. But enough to give you information before exposure reached critical levels. Enough to give you chance to identify and address the threat. Unless the divergence means something else. Unless you waking early wasn't random variation, but was caused by something. By symptom of early carbon monoxide exposure that manifested differently in your timeline. By your body's response to poisoning driving you toward consciousness despite exhaustion. Element 3. I'm not the first version of you to die. There are other timelines, other iterations, other Mark Sorens who died from different causes or the same cause at different times or in different circumstances. I'm just the one who died most recently. Just the one whose death is most temporally proximate to your current moment. But there are others, and they're sending emails too. Different messages, different warnings, different information based on their different experiences of dying. You might start receiving emails from other deceased versions, might get conflicting information, might receive warnings about threats that killed them but aren't relevant to your timeline. Or you might receive information that helps you identify patterns, that reveals what's actually happening. That explains why multiple versions of you are dying across multiple timelines. Because this isn't random, this isn't coincidence, this isn't natural variation in quantum branching of possible realities. This is intentional. Someone or something is killing us, is targeting Mark Soren across multiple timelines, is eliminating versions of us systematically, and the reason? The email cutoff. Not just ended mid-sentence, but stopped abruptly, as if transmission had been interrupted, as if whatever allowed these messages to cross timeline boundaries had been disrupted, as if someone or something had decided Mark had received enough information and needed to be prevented from learning more. Mark stared at his phone screen, waiting for the rest of the message to load, waiting for the sentence to complete, waiting for the crucial information that would explain why he was being targeted across multiple timelines. But nothing came. The email remained truncated, incomplete, deliberately cut short, and his apartment door, the one he'd checked minutes ago, the one that was locked with 3 deadbolts engaged, the one that was supposed to remain closed and secure until he left for work, was now slightly ajar, standing open maybe 3 inches, light from the hallway spilling through the gap, cold air from the corridor mixing with the warmth of his apartment. Mark hadn't opened it, hadn't touched it, hadn't gone near it since checking that it was locked and secure and exactly as it should be. But now it was open, and standing in the hallway, visible through the gap, holding what looked like envelope addressed to his apartment, was Mrs. Chen, looking directly at him through the partially open door with expression that suggested she'd been standing there for several seconds, several minutes, possibly longer, with expression that suggested she knew exactly what was happening, with expression that suggested she was involved. And the time on his phone read 8:47 a.m., 36 minutes before 9:23. 36 minutes before Mrs. Chen was supposed to find him dead, but she was already here, and the door that shouldn't be open was open. And Mark suddenly understood that the emails hadn't been sent to help him survive. They'd been sent to ensure he'd be exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to be doing when the moment arrived. They'd been instructions disguised as warnings, and he'd followed them perfectly. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Hallway. Mark's body locked into paralysis. Not the conscious decision to remain still, but the involuntary freezing that occurs when the nervous system detects threat so profound it bypasses rational processing and triggers pure survival response. The kind of immobility that small animals exhibit when predator attention fixes on them. When movement means detection, means death, and stillness offers only chance of survival, even though stillness also means vulnerability. means accepting whatever comes next without resistance or escape. Mrs. Chen stood in the hallway, holding the envelope with both hands, positioned precisely in center of the paper, as if the grip mattered, as if the exact placement of her fingers was critical element of whatever she was doing, as if she was performing ritual rather than simply delivering mail or notice or whatever the envelope supposedly contained. Her expression was wrong, not obviously threatening, not overtly hostile, but carrying quality of attention that was too focused, too intense, too absolutely concentrated on Mark to be normal neighborly interaction, to be casual encounter in apartment building hallway. She was looking at him the way scientists observe specimens, the way collectors examine acquisitions, the way predators assess prey before striking. "Mark," she said, and her voice was wrong too. Same tone and accent and cadence that characterized Mrs. Chen's normal speech patterns. Same slightly formal pronunciation that marked English as her second language despite decades of residence in the United States. But underlying those surface characteristics was something else. Something that used her voice the way someone might use borrowed instrument, playing correct notes, but failing to capture authentic emotional resonance that separated performance from genuine expression. "Your door was open," she continued, still holding the envelope with that precise two-handed grip. "I knocked, but you didn't answer. I was concerned." Mark's throat had closed. Words wouldn't form. His body refused to cooperate with his intention to speak, to respond, to produce sounds that would constitute normal social exchange and might diffuse whatever was happening, might transform this encounter from something threatening into something mundane. "I have noticed from building management," Mrs. Chen said, taking one step closer to the threshold, one step closer to crossing from hallway into Mark's apartment without explicit invitation, without permission, without the normal social protocols that governed entry into private spaces. "About the maintenance inspection, there's been change to schedule. The envelope." She was holding envelope, offering explanation for her presence, providing reason why she would be at his door at 8:47 a.m. on Tuesday morning when the original emails had said she wouldn't discover him until 9:23, when the timeline had supposedly diverged, when events were supposed to be occurring differently than they had in the alternate reality where Mark had already died. But the door. His door, the one he'd checked and confirmed, was locked with 3 deadbolts engaged. The one that was now inexplicably open despite no one having keys except him and building management and Mrs. Chen herself, who had master key for emergencies. Had she opened it? Had she used her master key to enter his apartment while he was reading the emails, while his attention was consumed by impossible messages describing his death, while he was distracted and vulnerable and not monitoring his physical surroundings because his consciousness was fully occupied processing information about carbon monoxide leaks and timeline convergence, and the revelation that something was systematically killing versions of him across multiple realities. "May I come in?" Mrs. Chen asked, but she was already moving forward, already crossing the threshold, already entering his space without waiting for response, because the question was formality rather than genuine request, was performance of social courtesy without actual deference to his autonomy or consent. "No," Mark finally managed to say, the word emerging as strangled sound that barely qualified as speech, that carried desperation and fear he couldn't suppress despite understanding that showing fear might trigger whatever predatory instinct was operating through Mrs. Chen's body, might signal weakness that would prompt attack. Mrs. Chen paused mid-step, 1 foot inside his apartment, 1 foot still in hallway. Body positioned exactly on the boundary between 2 spaces, as if the threshold itself mattered, as if crossing completely would activate something, would complete some process that required her full entry into his domain. "Mark," she said again, and this time the wrongness was more obvious, more audible, more clearly indicating that whatever spoke through her mouth wasn't entirely human, despite perfectly mimicking human speech patterns. "You need to read the notice. It's important. It concerns your safety." His safety. The phrase landed with particular weight, given the context of emails describing his death, given the information about carbon monoxide leaks and degraded detectors, and the systematic targeting of his alternate selves across multiple timelines. Leave it outside, Mark said, forcing his voice toward steadiness, forcing his body to move despite the paralysis, taking step backward away from the door, away from Mrs. Chen, increasing distance between them even though retreat felt like surrender, felt like acknowledging her threat and accepting his vulnerability. I need to explain it to you, Mrs. Chen insisted, taking another step inside, now fully within his apartment, door closing slightly behind her, not because she'd touched it, but because its position had shifted on its own, because physics was negotiable, because normal rules about doors and hinges and the relationship between objects and forces didn't apply when timeline boundaries degraded and alternate realities bled through into each other. Mark's phone buzzed. Email notification. Fourth message. Same impossible sender. He glanced at the screen without fully looking away from Mrs. Chen, without breaking eye contact, without giving her opportunity to advance further while his attention was divided. Subject: she's not Mrs. Chen. The preview text visible beneath the subject line. The entity wearing her body is what's been killing us. It moves between timelines by... The message cut off. Preview text didn't show complete sentence. Mark needed to open the email to read the rest, needed to understand what the entity was, how it moved between timelines, what it wanted, how to escape or resist or survive the next 6 minutes until 9:23 when he was supposed to be found dead. But opening the email meant looking away from Mrs. Chen, meant diverting attention, meant vulnerability. You're receiving messages, Mrs. Chen said, and she was looking at his phone now, was tracking the device with her eyes, was demonstrating knowledge she shouldn't have about his email notifications, about the impossible communications from his deceased alternate self. From the other yous, from the versions that didn't survive. They're trying to help you. It's touching, really. Futile, but touching. She took another step closer. Mark took another step back. The distance between them remained constant, but both their positions had shifted deeper into his apartment, farther from the door, farther from potential escape route. They always try to warn their living selves, Mrs. Chen continued, her voice taking on quality of amusement, of someone entertained by predictable behavior, of predator that enjoyed watching prey's futile resistance because the outcome was predetermined and the struggle only made eventual victory more satisfying. They send emails describing the deaths, providing details, identifying threats, as if information alone could prevent what's already written into the structure of converging timelines. What are you? Mark asked, because understanding enemy seemed crucial, even if understanding provided no tactical advantage, even if knowledge was just preparation for defeat rather than tool for escape. I'm the mechanism, Mrs. Chen said simply. I'm what ensures that timeline convergence proceeds correctly, that variations collapse back into singular stream, that your multiple selves consolidate into unified consciousness. You exist across too many timelines, Mark. You've fragmented, scattered yourself through quantum branches, and I'm what brings you back together. By killing me, Mark said. By consolidating you, Mrs. Chen corrected. Death is just the mechanism, the tool, the process by which scattered consciousness reunifies. Each time one of your alternates dies, their accumulated experience, their memories, their identity merges with the collective of yous. You think you're singular now, but you're not. You're composite. You contain traces of all the Mark Sorens who died before you, and when you die, you'll merge with them fully. You'll become part of the greater whole. Mark's back hit the wall. He'd retreated as far as the room allowed. Mrs. Chen was 6 feet away now, close enough to reach him in single step if she moved quickly, close enough that escape through door behind her was impossible without going through her first. The emails, Mark said, buying time, keeping her talking, hoping conversation would delay whatever action she was preparing to take. They're from the collective, from the merged consciousness of my dead alternates. Yes, Mrs. Chen confirmed. They want you to join them. They're lonely, incomplete. Each version of you that dies adds to their number, but also emphasizes the absence of the yous who haven't died yet, who are still living separate timelines, who haven't been integrated into unified consciousness. They send warnings because they want you to survive long enough to help other yous survive. They want to maximize the number of Mark Sorens who reach natural end of life before consolidation occurs, because natural death allows for gentler merger, allows consciousness to prepare, allows identity to accept dissolution rather than resisting violently. But you prevent that, Mark said. You kill us before natural death. You force violent consolidation. I accelerate the process, Mrs. Chen said, because timeline fragmentation is dangerous, because quantum branching creates instability, because allowing infinite variations of single consciousness to exist simultaneously across infinite realities produces metaphysical contradictions that threaten structural integrity of existence itself. Someone has to prune the branches. Someone has to consolidate the variations. Someone has to ensure that consciousness doesn't fragment beyond recovery. She was directly in front of him now, had closed the distance while speaking, was within arm's reach. Close enough that Mark could smell her, not Mrs. Chen's normal scent of soap and tea and the slight mustiness of old building, but something else underneath, something that smelled like ozone and copper and the particular odor that preceded electrical storms, that marked atmospheric conditions immediately before lightning struck. Your carbon monoxide detector won't save you, she said quietly. Your window opening won't save you. Your understanding won't save you. The consolidation is scheduled for 9/23, has been scheduled for weeks, has been inevitable since the moment the first of your alternates died and began the merger process. You can delay it briefly, can resist for minutes or hours, but you can't escape. The timeline convergence is already too advanced. Mark's phone buzzed again. Another email. Fifth message. He glanced at the screen. Subject: the door preview. Text: the entity can only maintain physical form for limited time. It needs to complete consolidation before 9/23 or the window closes. If you survive until 9/24, you escape this iteration. But you need to. The preview text cut off again. Mark needed to read the full message, needed to understand what he was supposed to do, needed the complete information. But Mrs. Chen's hand was reaching for him now, extending toward his chest, fingers positioned in configuration that looked purposeful, intentional, specific. Not random gesture, but precise arrangement that suggested ritual significance, that implied her touch would activate something, would trigger the consolidation process, would begin transformation that would merge his consciousness with the collective of his deceased alternates. Mark's back was against wall. No room for further retreat, no space to evade, no options except confrontation or surrender. His eyes met Mrs. Chen's, and he saw something behind her pupils, something vast and geometric and absolutely inhuman, something that looked like the entity was visible through her eyes, the way landscape is visible through windows, the way Mrs. Chen's body was just aperture, just opening, just temporary access point for something that existed primarily in dimensions human perception couldn't directly apprehend. Time seemed to slow. Mark's consciousness processed information with artificial clarity, born from extreme stress, from the brain flooding itself with neurochemicals that enhanced focus and expanded subjective experience of seconds into minutes, that gave him time to think, time to decide, time to choose how to respond in moment that would determine whether he survived until 9/24 and escaped this iteration, as the email had phrased it, or whether he died on schedule and merged with collective of his alternate selves. His phone was in his left hand. The email was still open, preview text still visible. The door was behind Mrs. Chen, 10 feet away, partially closed but not locked because she'd entered without securing it behind herself, because she'd been confident he couldn't escape, because the entity wearing her body understood that humans in extreme fear often froze rather than fighting or fleeing. But Mark had spent 18 months watching his father die, had learned that death was ordinary, was mundane, was just biological process, had learned that fear of death was often worse than death itself, had learned that accepting mortality paradoxically provided freedom to take risks that fear would prevent. So instead of freezing, instead of surrendering, instead of allowing Mrs. Chen's hand to make contact with his chest and trigger whatever consolidation mechanism her touch would activate, Mark lunged forward, not away from her, toward her, closing distance instead of creating it, moving with violence that surprised them both because it violated expected pattern, because prey was supposed to flee, not attack, because his choice was tactically insane unless his goal was something other than direct confrontation. His goal was the door. He crashed into Mrs. Chen with full body weight, using momentum and surprise to knock her off balance, to disrupt her positioning, to create opening. She fell backward with expression of shock that suggested the entity hadn't anticipated this response, hadn't modeled this possibility, hadn't prepared for victim who chose aggression over defensive retreat. Mark didn't stop to confirm her position, didn't waste time checking whether she was injured or would recover quickly. Just ran for the door, yanked it fully open, stumbled into hallway without looking back. The corridor was empty. No neighbors, no witnesses, no one to call for help or verify what was happening. Just fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the distant sound of elevator machinery operating, despite it being scheduled for maintenance inspection, despite building-wide notice that residents should use stairs. Mark ran for the stairwell. His apartment was third floor. He needed to descend 2 flights and exit the building and get outside where there would be people, witnesses, crowds that might prevent entity wearing Mrs. Chen from completing consolidation in public space. His phone buzzed continuously in his hand. Multiple emails arriving simultaneously. 6th, 7th, 8th messages from deceased alternates, sending urgent warnings, sending tactical information, sending everything they'd learned from their own deaths about how to survive, how to delay, how to escape. He burst through stairwell door and started descending, taking stairs 3 at a time, risking broken ankle or worse, but accepting the danger because stopping meant capture, meant consolidation, meant death and merger with collective that wanted him to join them, but also wanted him to survive long enough to help other versions survive. Behind him, above him on the 3rd floor, he heard his apartment door slam open fully, heard footsteps that didn't sound human, that made wrong noises against linoleum, that suggested Mrs. Chen's body was no longer maintaining illusion of normal movement. The entity was pursuing, was following him downstairs, was closing distance with speed that shouldn't be possible for elderly woman, that confirmed Mrs. Chen's body was just vehicle now, just shell being operated by something that didn't need to respect biological limitations or physical constraints. Mark reached 2nd floor landing. 1 more flight to ground level, 1 more flight to exit. 20 steps between him and outside. His phone screen showed 9:18 a.m., 5 minutes until the scheduled time of death. 5 minutes until 9:23 when consolidation was supposed to occur. 5 minutes to survive and escape this iteration and postpone the merger. He descended final flight, crashed through ground floor exit door, emerged into lobby where several residents were waiting because elevator was still non-functional, despite maintenance inspection being scheduled for 9 a.m., despite building notice, despite everything that was supposed to be happening according to ordinary reality, where buildings operated according to predictable patterns, and neighbors remained neighbors, and death arrived through natural causes, rather than through entities that moved between timelines, consolidating fragmented consciousness. The residents looked at him, registered his panic, his fear, his desperate flight. But none of them moved. None of them reacted. None of them offered help or asked questions or demonstrated any awareness that something extraordinary was occurring, because they weren't real. Mark understood this with sudden clarity. These people standing in lobby were just background, just filler, just convincing details the entity had generated to maintain illusion of normal building operations while it pursued him through stairwell and closed distance between them. The front door was 15 feet away, glass and metal, simple push-bar mechanism, easy exit. Mark ran for it, and Mrs. Chen emerged from stairwell behind him, still pursuing, still closing distance, still moving with wrong speed and wrong grace and wrong everything that marked her body as occupied by something other than the elderly Chinese woman who'd lived in building for 23 years and managed property and maintained records and collected rent checks. Mark hit the push bar. Door opened. Cold October air rushed in. Street sounds became audible. Traffic, voices, the normal acoustic environment of urban morning. He stumbled outside onto sidewalk. Real pedestrians walked past. Real cars drove by. Real pigeons scattered from his sudden emergence. Real reality surrounded him with its mundane details and ordinary physics and the basic reliability of world that operated according to consistent rules. He'd escaped the building, had survived until his phone showed 9:23 a.m. The scheduled moment had arrived. Mark waited for consolidation, waited for the merger, waited for his consciousness to fragment and disperse and merge with collective of deceased alternates. But nothing happened. He remained himself, remained singular, remained alive and separate and unconsolidated. Behind him, visible through the building's glass door, Mrs. Chen stood motionless in lobby. The entity wearing her body was watching him with expression that combined frustration and something like respect, something like acknowledgement that he'd escaped this iteration, that he'd survived past the scheduled moment, that the window had closed and consolidation would need to be rescheduled for different time in different circumstances. But her mouth moved. Mark couldn't hear through the glass, but could read her lips as she delivered final message. Next Tuesday, same time, you can't keep escaping. And then Mrs. Chen's expression changed back to normal. The entity withdrew. The possession ended. Mrs. Chen looked confused, disoriented, uncertain why she was standing in lobby at 9:24 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Mark's phone buzzed one final time. Subject, you survived for now. He opened the email. Small. You did well. Better than most alternates. Better than I did. You recognized the threat, took aggressive action, escaped before scheduled consolidation. But the entity is right. You can't keep escaping. Eventually, you'll miss a warning. Eventually, you'll fail to recognize the signs. Eventually, consolidation will occur, unless you find the source. Unless you discover why you fragmented across multiple timelines in the first place. Unless you identify what caused the original quantum branching that created all these variations of Mark Soren existing simultaneously across parallel realities. That's what you need to investigate now. That's what you need to understand before next Tuesday. That's what might give you chance at permanent survival rather than temporary postponement. Check your email history. Find the messages from before October 1st. Find the correspondence you've forgotten. Find the decision you made that caused the fragmentation. Because it wasn't accident. It wasn't natural quantum variation. It was choice. And choices can be unmade. Good luck. You'll need it. Mark, P.S. Rachel's coffee invitation is genuine. She's not part of this. Meet her. Tell her what's happening. You'll need ally for what comes next. Mark stood on the sidewalk, breathing hard, watching Mrs. Chen return to her normal activities inside the lobby, watching the fake residence dissolve now that the entity had withdrawn and no longer needed to maintain the illusion. He'd survived, for now, until next Tuesday. Until 9:23 a.m. on October 30th, when the entity would try again, when consolidation would be rescheduled, when he'd need to escape again, or finally surrender to the merger his deceased alternates both wanted and warned him against. But he had 7 days. 7 days to investigate. 7 days to understand why he'd fragmented across timelines. 7 days to find the source and maybe, possibly, hopefully discover how to reverse the process, how to unbranch the quantum variations, how to restore himself to singular existence that wouldn't require constant vigilance against entities that moved between realities, consolidating consciousness that shouldn't be scattered, but was. His phone buzzed with text from Rachel. Still good for 10:30? I'm already at the coffee place. Mark checked the time. 9:36 a.m. He had 54 minutes to get there. 54 minutes to decide how much to tell her. 54 minutes to prepare explanation for impossible situation that would sound like delusion or breakdown unless he could provide evidence that would verify his claims. He started walking toward Henderson Street, where the coffee shop waited, where Rachel waited, where perhaps he'd find the ally the email suggested he needed for what came next. And as he walked, Mark wondered how many other versions of himself were receiving similar emails right now in similar timelines, were escaping similar consolidation attempts, were beginning similar investigations into the fragmentation that had doomed so many Mark Sorens to death and merger across infinite parallel realities. How many of them would survive long enough to find the source? How many would fail? And what would happen if they all succeeded simultaneously? If every surviving Mark Soren across every timeline discovered the truth at the same moment and made the same choice to unmake the original branching? Would they all collapse back into singular existence? Or would the consolidation occur naturally, peacefully, correctly this time, without the entity's forced acceleration, without violent merger, without the deaths that had claimed so many alternates already. He didn't know, but he had 7 days to find out. 7 days until next Tuesday. 7 days until 9:23 a.m. 7 days until the entity tried again. And this time, Mark intended to be ready.